Greetings, bloggers, vloggers, followers, and potters. Dustin here from Dustin's Dynasty, here at you again this week with another edition of this week's vlog. If you haven't met me in a while or if you're new here, my name is Dustin. I'm autistic. I have other mental health diagnoses, and I'm a middle-aged man just trying to make it by in this world, living life through being diagnosed with autism and other diagnoses, as I just said. Uh, Life is what it is, and we're going to continue that on. I've been living on my own for a total of almost 8 years now, over five in this current situation. And I've been probably working part-time for it overall throughout my life, but in my current position for over 16 years. And this week, we're going to talk about accessibility versus ability. And I think, we're in Disability Pride Month, and I wasn't going to do a real different episode this week. God had other plans with my vacation. I had gone on a vacation for the first time in several years. I had really hadn't had a real vacation in almost a decade, and that was one thing. Being in a bed that was other than mine, since I've been living in this apartment, over 5 years has been a thing. So it was all new and it did bring its own anxiety, but once we got going, we seemed to start to do okay. We had a very good vacation, so I slept very much on schedule. Uh, but we're here today and we're back in Pennsylvania. We're adjusting to our routine, but through the week, out and about, seeing different things, navigating the world that we are in, that is always built different than our neurodiverse selves. It made me think about accessibility, especially with Disability Pride Month this month, and how do we use those accommodations? When do we need those accommodations? How do we use those accommodations without shame, feeling shame about it for ourselves, not causing distraction towards others, not feeling embarrassed to need to use things that we may need, and why is it that you know feeling that we don't owe and no everyone an explanation, but maybe we owe ourselves as autistic folks or those that are caring for autistic folks or those with special needs the explanation. And I think sometimes we don't realize things. Let's take, for example, the screen behind me at Fort Sumter. We took a day trip to Fort Sumter this week. Charleston, very hot. It was very hot this week. But, through the most part, I managed. And sometimes we have to have accommodations. Sometimes there's things, that are provided to us. You may not be able to see it behind me in this photograph. One thing for sure, there are steps to get into the visitor center here at Fort Sumter. On the boat to board the boat to go to the fortress itself. And the elevator was broken, but that wasn't, I am able-bodied. I have disabilities, but when we I got to the top, it had one of those revolving doors, and I'm a little anxious about them. But there were, it was the entrance was both entrances to this building was flanked with standard doors, of which I used. That really helped. As far as the comfort facilities, there are none on the fort itself. They were on the boat if you so choose to use them, but I used the ones here in the visitor center, and there were no specific single occupancy ones. So, I can, in a pinch, use a standard restroom. I can use, facilities that are just for everybody. Um, that may not be the case for some. And, on my way to my destination in North Carolina, where I stayed, we stopped at a few rest areas as we crossed the state on Interstate 40. I know some states have done great regard in the upkeep of their rest areas. to include, family or single occupancy restrooms. And for those who need it, and, for those situations that are indeed family inclusive, whatever, those facilities are available in those moments of those quick pinches or quick stops. I do not need them, but it was good to know they were there. Also, being able to use this and then getting onto the boat without issue, having the needs covered, basic needs, human needs covered, those sort of things. I was able to do things. Now when we got on to back to Fort Sumter, when we got on to the fort, there were lifts if you needed them. They were older. I personally did not need them. I was able to do the steps at least to get to the levels of the fort that I wanted to access. It was ironic that my family members asked, did I use the lifts? And I said, no, I didn't use the lifts because I know I didn't need to go through all that issue of using a lift. I was able, even though it was extremely hot in Charleston, I was able to, go up the steps and into the where I wanted to go. Same with coming back. I used steps, same procedure. In most cases, I did. We stayed in a condominium in a house in a HOA. I was able to use the steps when I could. Going down is better than going up, basically due to my weight. And while I'm ashamed to say that, there was an elevator there for the purpose of that. It's just those things. Sometimes you need accommodations, sometimes you don't. And I think, when we get into that world of, choosing what we need, we can't feel ashamed of ourselves for needing things that make life easier for us. And at the same time, we don't owe people that want to seek, you know, an answer or want to cause a ruckus or want to know why we're using these facilities, even though we have invisible disabilities. Why we need to use facilities that may not they may not understand. Maybe we as autistic adults or those with special needs may have a fear of using a standard multiple occupancy restroom. Maybe there's issues or needs that are related to that. Maybe it's just something that is. I mean, we look at the world today, there are Walmarts, across the nation that have family restrooms, and there are times I will use that restroom as opposed to the standard restroom for my own comfort when it is needed compared, and there'll be sometimes I'll use the men's room. It's all, it matters in some ways or another. The same could be said for why I use transportation, for what I use it for, and why. That's really not up to anybody's, uh, you know, interpretation other than those granting me those things, and for me explaining why is only to those who need to know, that is those that hold who are the gatekeepers of granting accommodations and such. It is not for the purview of just some random stranger in public asking why you're using an accessible toilet, why you're using a door, why you're doing this or why you're doing that. That is not really what their need is. It's really none of their business. And it's not just saying that it's not their business. It's just saying that, there is a thing called the HIPAA Act, and that is protected information and and that's what it's for. But in the end, it is what, protects us. It's what the Americans with Disabilities Act was created for in the 90s, early 1990, and life was different then. Buses were not as accessible as they are today. Um, you know, Restrooms were not accessible. There was not equal access, and sometimes what was given was not even fair. Sometimes the way individuals were treated was not fair. It was not equal. We saw access be added to buildings like post offices, and including the one in my hometown. For example, it had steps to every entrance before 1990. And in the 90s, when the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed, an entrance was made. Ramps were added to one of the entrances to the post office so that that could be had. Granted, it's not a thing in all post offices, but in some eventually, facilities to some degree were held, that were constructed, especially after 1990, were made to provide those things, and so such was made with all future construction following 1990. And we still have, those advocates, who are still there and still preview new facilities today to test the strengths of the Americans with Disabilities Act. I can remember, definitely, a couple of examples in my county alone. A restaurant that once opened that had to be modified with the restrooms before it opened. It doesn't exist anymore. And a campground that had built new restrooms at the time, a new shower house, and that the tile did not work properly and had to be redone. We see a lot of construction done, especially in our state. I know at least in Pennsylvania, the state park system has included more family inclusive restrooms, has included just buildings with restrooms and showers single use more than the multiple use old school ways. And, that was fine back then. Things were different. The world has changed, but as far as accommodations, there's times we need things, there's times we don't. It's not in the purview of others, it is for our own purview, for our own decisions to make. As that's not for somebody to need. And it's, we as autistic people or people with special needs or people who need those accessible accommodations, it is not something that is not always standard or set in stone. It is, fluid to the situation. And, I feel that if it is needed by someone, whether that's myself or someone else, it's not our place to judge that. It's my reasoning is my reasoning, and it's not that I'm being lazy. It's not that I can't. It's not that I want to show off for myself. It's that I need support, I need accommodation, so on and so forth. Those are just some of the examples that I have about, why it is important, why we celebrate disability pride, why people, why it's all disabilities, whether it's visible, whether it's invisible, and why we all matter, as a disability community, having our disability pride, that disabled people matter. That's just what it is. And I will close this video today with a picture of me here in front of Fort Sumter, at the visitor center there, with me wearing my disability pride shirt, not only to make a statement, just because I felt like wearing it that day. And, it's not about, I need, extra treatment or special treatment. I'm just a citizen in the pack of a bunch of people, maybe going to the fortress, and, maybe it's to make people aware, maybe it's just knowing that, it's okay to do what I need to do. So without further ado, I want to thank you for watching today. I know we kept it short and sweet, but that's what I wasn't even planning on doing one. Getting some rest here from returning from vacation, but I did want to include this. This was on my mind throughout the last part of the week. And as I was coming home from the ocean, it was wrote into, in some cases, in a blog post that'll be out in April. But anyway, I'll thank you. Follow, tap that notification bell on YouTube, as you may be following, Facebook, Instagram, X, Pinterest, TikTok at Dustin's Dynasty. I'm on the web. That address is www.dustinsdynastyusa.com. If you haven't heard anything, if you go under Linktree, linktr.ee/Dustin's Dynasty, you will find all my links, my newsletter sign up. I'll have some features there this week. I included some last week about the national park system and sensory needs, and there's a great deal of things there. So, with that being said, I want to thank you for listening. Remember, take care of yourselves, stay safe out there, stay cool. You matter, you are enough, and you are loved. Have a great weekend, everyone. We'll talk at you soon. Bye for now.